¿Cómo sacar a Europa de la recesión pandémica? El profesor Joseph Stiglitz, Premio Nobel de Economía y mentor de Janet Yellen, la secretaria del Tesoro y expresidenta de la Reserva Federal Americana, nos explica las líneas generales que propone para que la Unión Europea nos saque de esta crisis. Le interpelan dos exministros de Economía, Yanis Varoufakis y Jordi Sevilla. Y complementa la conversación la catedrática de Economía de la Universidad de Barcelona, Ana M.ª Gil y el ex primer ministro de Italia, Romano Prodi. Comenzamos con el profesor Stiglitz. So the Trump presidency is over, right? But not before causing a big disruption and challenging American democracy, putting American democracy at risk. And somehow, what do you expect to happen in terms of political disruption? Do you expect anything worse to happen? Or do you think things have come back to normal institutional work?
It's certainly come back much more normal. It is so wonderful for us to see a new administration with a high level of competence, a commitment to institutions, to rebuilding the institutions that were so badly destroyed by the Trump administration. You can't have a government without competent people in the administration and people who are devoted to serving society. And Biden has recruited a large team of very competent people. So that's the good news.
Great.
The bad news is that Trump still has a significant number of followers in
72 million votes. That's a lot.
Yes, exactly. And when he ran for president back in 2016, he made the statement that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and his supporters would stay with him.
Whoa.
And it was a forecast.
He did.
He tested that, and it is clear that his followers stick with him. But on the other hand, a large number of Republicans refused. And maybe that is also a message that's important, that there were Republican people in the state of Georgia who refused to change the votes, even under pressure. There were 7 Republican senators who voted for conviction. A large number, vast majority did not. But even then, they condemned what he did. But they were playing politics.
Right. Those are strictly politics. But concerning the economy that made this politics happen, the reasons that explain populism and Trumpism maybe are still without being solved. And inequality, and the lack of opportunities. And what do you think the new president, Mr. Biden, is addressing those issues properly? In which way?
He certainly has moved those issues to the front of his agenda. Inequalities of income, disparities across race, gender. The people he's appointed to his economics team those are issues which are very core to their very being. So he's appointed people without that kind of commitment, who've done research in that area, who have advocated for that. So that makes me optimistic.
Great. Nice to know. Yep.
So the difficulty getting it through Congress, there's not a large majority, a bare majority in the Senate and a little majority in the House. And the Republicans are not committed to that agenda. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to say that it's going to be easy, but it's certainly at the core of his commitment.
In the global picture, the global peak that includes Europe, are we doing the right things to make the reasons that increase populism to be also addressed? Or are we missing something, Professor?
I think, in a sense, you are. And it has to do with the structure of the EU. What one needs is to have redistribution and an economic framework that addresses the imbalances of power between workers and corporations. And unfortunately, the structure of the EU makes that difficult. So for instance, the taxation is still at the national level. But that means if a country imposes high taxes on corporations, they'll move. If they impose high taxes on individuals, many of them will move. And we've seen that actually happen. So the incongruence between free mobility of people and redistributive taxation and legislation trying to address the imbalances of power creates a contradiction. And Europe has not yet addressed that contradiction.
Precisely, digitalization was a promise in the beginning of shared prosperity, that it has ended up being low salaries and a handful of billionaires. What can be done? I mean, you just say one thing, taxation, but the big digital platforms are doing fiscal illusion, as you said. And do we need a new social contract?
Well, very much so. So, I mean, what Apple and Google did in Europe was unconscionable. They claimed that all the profits they made in Europe were attributable to Ireland. And Ireland made special deals where they paid almost no taxes at all. So that Ireland was stealing effectively from the rest of Europe in order to create a very few jobs. So what that tells you is, one, the structure was wrong.
Right.
And there was not enough solidarity within the countries. They were willing to undermine Luxembourg and Ireland. So they were willing to undermine their partners in Europe. So yes, very much something else has to be done. And as I say, it's about taxation, but it's also about the rules. And this is an issue about the rules within Europe, but also the rules globally. I'm hopeful that Biden will be more open to a global conversation about rewriting these rules in ways that are fairer than Trump was.
Hi, Joe. How are you doing? You look great. We miss you here in Barcelona, in the Royal Academy, your academy. I have a question for you. So, in the recent times, we have experienced a period of deflation with negative interest rates and a progressive accumulation of liquidity in our economies. In this context, the reflation seems to be the big concern right now in the United States and in Europe. Should we be scared of it? What do you think about it? Thanks a lot. See you soon.
I think the Biden administration and Treasury Secretary Yellen have been very, very clear that you have to balance risks. And the risk of doing too little right now is much greater than the risk of doing too much. And one of the reasons why I very strongly agree with that is that in the small probability that it is too much, we have tools. We can raise interest rates, we can raise taxes. And both of those would be good for our economy. What do I mean by that? We've been in a zero interest rate environment since 2008. That's not a good situation. It means, what does it mean to price capital at zero? Capital is scarce. And when you price it at zero, you get all kinds of distortions in the capital market. We sometimes call the search for yield. Risky assets being priced at almost the same price as safe assets. All kinds of distortions. So it would be a lot better if we moved to a capital market where capital was priced the way it should be. So that was one thing. And secondly, in the United States, our tax system isn't working. The average tax rate is too low relative to our needs for investment in education, technology, infrastructure, everything. And we have a regressive tax system where those at the top pay a lower tax rate than those down below. Now, everybody understands that we need to correct that, but there is hesitancy to do that right now when the economy is so weak. So if it turned out that the economy was stimulated in the way that Summers was worried, then we could actually start doing the things that we need. Finally, what we've learned in other periods is that the only time that marginalized workers are brought into the labor force, and the only time in which the huge disparities in incomes get slightly reduced, is when we run a very tight labor market.
I see.
So addressing the problems of inequality, which are central to our political and social problems, would be helped by having a tight economy. So I actually think that given the scarring of the economy from the pandemic, given that the rest of the world is not going to be recovering as fast as the United States, the depths of the downturn in Europe, and other countries around the world, I think it's unlikely that we will coming back with a V-shaped recovery. And so I think those fears of inflation are exaggerated, but we have to admit that we haven't had anything like this. So forecasting is inevitably going to be uncertain. Balancing the risk, Biden is doing exactly the right thing.
Caro Joseph, abbiamo capito che noi dobbiamo uscire dalla crisi solo con un'azione comune europea e da un lato la vaccinazione, dall'altro uno sforzo di ripresa che si è concentrato, secondo le regole europee, sull'ambiente. Importantissimo, ci credo, ne sono convinto, però noi ci siamo posti in Europa degli obiettivi molto ambiziosi. Allora, questi comportano dei costi più elevati nelle imprese. io sono economista industriale, me ne preoccupo. Allora, come è possibile coordinarsi con Stati Uniti e Cina in modo che l'Europa non sia messa troppo in difficoltà e magari sia costretta a fare una marcia indietro, perché la ripresa la dobbiamo fare tutti assieme.
I think, back in 2008-9, the Great Recession, Gordon Brown led the G20 in a coordinated, strong expansion, including a major expansion of special drawing rights at the IMF. I am worried that we are not doing as much globally. Europe has not had this magnitude of the stimulus that the United States has had. And
Absolutely.
That part of the reason why the economic downturn in Europe has been so much worse than the United States, only part, but even though you've managed the disease better than the United States, nobody could have managed it worse than Trump. The fact is that we went ahead with a bazooka. It was not well designed, but it was big enough that it limited the economic downturn. In the case of China, they are the only large country coming back to growth. But you have to compare the growth that they had in 2009, 10, 11 with the growth that they've had in 2020 and forecast for 2021. Much more anemic, less than half the size earlier. And they have resorted much more to inward-looking policies, and so their trade surplus has actually, as a percentage of GDP, has increased. So that means they won't be providing as much impetus for the rest of the world. Finally, so far, the international community has not approved new issuance of SDRs, special drawing rights. Trump vetoed that for no good reason. The Biden administration is currently discussing that, and I am hopeful that that will be supported.
Recientemente se ha hecho pública un manifiesto firmado por un grupo amplio de economistas de todo el mundo, encabezado por Piketty, que yo mismo he firmado desde España, solicitando al Banco Central Europeo que condone la deuda emitida por los estados europeos como consecuencia del COVID y que figura en el balance del Banco Central Europeo a cambio de que se destine esa cuantía a nuevas inversiones verdes y de transición ecológica. ¿Qué opina de esa propuesta?
Oh, I think there has to be significant debt restructuring. The borrower and the lender may have made the loan in good faith, but events happen. There's a principle in law called force majeure, necessity, and every country has a bankruptcy law. What is bankruptcy? It says, I owe you money, but I'm not going to pay you. We used to have in the 19th century bankrupt debtor prisons. We view those as unconscionable. And in the 19th century, countries would go to war to collect debts. We think that that's unconscionable. That's not acceptable today. So historically, the debt restructurings have been too little and too late, resulting in enormous suffering. And the creditor doesn't get back any more. He would have gotten back more if they had managed it better. So I think there is a need for debt restructuring. I think the proposals of what are called debt for nature swaps are actually an important part of the possible way forward for some of these debt restructurings. So I hope that that will be part of the agenda going forward. There are many countries now that are precisely in that kind of situation.
Europe is doing too little, too late. I mean, it should be doing more and more faster to fight the recession caused by the pandemic. That's one idea we take. But I must pay tribute, as a European citizen, to your clear view. 10 years ago, we were here, the same place, and you delivered a speech asking for the same. I mean, for more public spending, more stimulus. And you were right. But 10 years later, everybody agrees on that. But it's probably too late, too little, too late. Again. So how do you feel about being the prophet of the end of austericide? You remember austericide? Austerity. Yeah. Now nobody is claiming, is making the same case for austerity. How do you feel about that?
Well, you know, we had 40 years of these neoliberal doctrines of what I call market fundamentalism. There was a certain irony because they became fashionable with Reagan in the United States, Thatcher in the UK, and other people throughout Europe. Those ideas became fashionable just when economists were explaining why they weren't right. That is to say, there were economists talked about imperfect information, asymmetries of market power, game theory developed, behavioral economics. So we in the economic science were explaining why markets often don't work. And yet, among politicians, with the defeat of communism, there was a euphoria that markets worked very well. And now, 40 years later, we've finally come to the realization that markets often don't work well. And it's, you know, sometimes there's an expression, you know, we're going back to the past. The ideas of Keynes that fiscal policy is important, austerity is a disaster. Hoover, what I call in the United States, we call Hoover economics, what led to the Great Depression. That is now well accepted. Obviously, in the intervening 80, 90 years, we've learned a lot. We've gotten much more sophisticated in our understandings and our arguments. But in the spite of all that, the basic insight that fiscal policy can be an important instrument and that monetary policy in a downturn often doesn't work, those two insights are fundamental and are the two insights that Keynes had 90 years ago.
In the interim, in the midterm, we have paid a high price of political instability. We have elections in Barcelona last Sunday, the far right skyrocketing. We didn't have far right in Spain. Now we do have a worrisome race of the far right parties. And well, the political price of not addressing in a creative Keynesian way the economic inequality has an important repercussion in our political system. But do you think we have time? And I mean, between politics and the economy, do we have time to act? And do you think the same way inequality makes the far right race, it can happen the other way around? I mean, the incentive politics, the generous welfare can dismantle the far right claims?
I think so. I mean, obviously every country has its differences and there are separate issues, multiple issues. In the United States, race plays a very important role. In Spain, issues of separatism
Yeah.
plays a very important role. And economics is not everything. I'm an economist, but we have to recognize
Right.
that there are many other things going on that are important. But what gives me hope in for what I see going on in the United States is that the majority of Americans and the vast majority of young people, but not all, are very supportive of the progressive agenda.
Good.
They're concerned about climate. They are concerned about inequality. They want to raise the minimum wage. They want everybody to have access to education, to health care. What I call the progressive agenda. Not radical, it's what you might say a minimum, it's not revolutionary in any sense. They want that. And we are wealthy enough. If you think about where we were 80 years ago and where we are today, we're wealthy enough to afford it.
Yep.
If we are not excessively selfish. And so I think that is the good news. And the question is going to continue to be whether we can make our politics reflect what I think is a vast majority of our citizens want.
Have you changed your views on the euro? And if so, in which way?
Well, obviously during the euro crisis, I was very concerned about whether it would survive. That's more than a decade ago, and it obviously has survived.
Look, last March, yeah, almost a year ago, when the pandemic started, our movement DiEM25 came out, and I played a major role in that, with our blueprint. What, how should the European Union respond to the reinforcement of the deflationary forces which were pre-existing the pandemic and which would be turbocharged by the pandemic? So asking the question, to what extent is the difference in structure, not just size, a problem?
What Europe did together in responding to the pandemic was very impressive. Back in 2010, I said you ought to issue Eurobonds to help finance the rescue. They refused. In this pandemic, they agreed to do it. In this pandemic, it was clear you needed to give grants rather than loans. There was a debate about the proportion,
I remember,
but a significant amount went in the form of grants. Europe has come together over a common agenda of fighting climate change. So, and they've abandoned austerity. So all of those are very positive signs. On the other hand, I had hoped that when they issued the Eurobonds, they would also create the mechanism for repaying it through a common European digital tax, corporate tax, wealth tax, financial transaction tax, environmental taxes, a whole set of ways they could have strengthened Europe's financial position and been able to address the problems of inequality more effectively within Europe. They didn't do that. So I would say that what has happened in this pandemic is really cause for celebration. And holds up the possibility of a stronger Europe. But it's, as everybody said back in the Euro crisis, it's a work in progress.
I see. Well, one of the limitations, now I was thinking of why I didn't invest more in the stock market. Just kidding. Because, but no, not kidding. I mean, in fact, one of the limitations, it's been said, but I thought about it, of the stimulus policies is that they make, I mean, the share market, that Wall Street goes skyrocketing. Not everybody, of course, but some shares are really going high. And the question is, maybe the Fed policy of buying assets, buying the stock, buying the markets makes, makes inequality to grow, because not everybody's in the market, not everybody's invest. And most of the people that it's invest are at least middle classes. Well, not to mention those kids from, from the Robin Hood and so on. But this is really marginal. But many, many people is out of the market, right? They are not in. So they don't benefit from this prosperity driven by the Fed policies. Instead, another alternative will be putting money in people's bank accounts, right? Like you guys did in the States. You just put, correct me if I'm wrong, but you just put some money in everybody's bank account. What do you think, that reminds me of the helicopter throwing money around, right? Those policies have pros and cons. What is your view on them?
I think you are absolutely right that the relying on monetary policy for stimulus, especially beginning with QE and going through the more recent policies, the major beneficiary is the market, the stock market, and the major owner of the stock market are the people at the very, very top, the 1%, the 1/10 of 1%. The bottom 50% own almost no stock, a little bit through retirement programs, but relatively little. So it increases inequality. The only justification is that when you don't have fiscal policy, it's the only game in town. And even a little of that trickles down into increased demand, and that's increased jobs, and then obviously helps ordinary people. But the alternative is fiscal policy. And fiscal policy directly, especially the way that it's being done by, proposed by Biden, puts money in the hands of people who really need it, and is exactly the opposite distributive effects of monetary policy. So and interestingly, it actually is much more effective, because putting money in the pockets of the 1%, they don't spend very much of it.
Yep.
Putting money in the pockets of the bottom 50%, they spend almost all of it. So you get so much more bang for the buck. So both in terms of, you might say, moral justice, and in terms of economic effectiveness, the fiscal policy, if designed right, can be much more effective.
Uh-huh. So what do you, are you coming to Spain soon? Question. And if you come, Joe, very welcome anytime. Tell us, what will you look at as a prophet in Keynesian? I'm just making it a little metaphor. What you will look at in our country? You've been several times. I have the pleasure of guiding you in Barcelona with Carmen Netzel, and we have a great time. But what will you pay attention to see if the country is doing well or not?
Well, I always think that you need to both look at statistics and look with your eyes. And both, you often don't get a complete picture just looking with your eyes, but you often get a better feel for what is going on. And so you need both. And obviously concerns are unemployment, hidden unemployment. When I say hidden unemployment, there are often self-employed people, but they're working a third time, quarter time. There's a lot of disguised unemployment historically in Spain. One of the problems in Spain for many years, you might say the business model of Spain was too reliant on real estate bubble.
Yep.
And
it's not the case anymore.
Not adequately diversified. So you want to see what are people doing, the spirit of the country. Now, everybody, this is a very hard time everywhere. So that the lockdown has been hard, and particularly hard, I think, on societies that are more outgoing, more
You're right. You're right. You're right.
So it takes a different toll on different kinds of societies.
Right. And just to finish, in the last lap of our talk, we don't want to abuse your time and your schedule of classes. And I wonder how you have living the pandemic, and what has been your economical thoughts? What have you learned so far from the pandemic? And what was, of course, I guess during Trump handling, you were in indignation, right? Because the guy was doing very bad. We were astonished at the way he was. But I would like you to tell us in your own words, how was your experience and what have you learned so far from the pandemic?
So one aspect of the pandemic that was very personal is I lived, you might say, the K-shaped aspect of this pandemic. The K-shape was the idea that those at the bottom suffered a lot.
Yeah.
Those at the top were able to continue with what they did in an ordinary way over Zoom. And so I was cloistered in my apartment, traveled more than I did normally in a virtual sense.
Okay.
Because I could be in India in the morning,
wow,
China in the afternoon, New Zealand,
wow.
Europe, all in one, Latin America, Argentina. Normally I couldn't have done that. Normally
Right.
I would say, I'm sorry, I'm in China today. I can't.
Yeah, that's fun.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
But in one day, I could be on 3 continents. I could be in Africa. I could talk to people. So in that sense, it was an enriching experience. And we have many conversations that enabled me to keep in touch with what was going on. But at the same time, one realized, you look at the data, what was going on, who was experiencing the brunt of the disease, who was losing their jobs. It was devastating here in the United States because it was so badly managed. And I think, we were talking earlier about the end of neoliberalism. I think everywhere in the world, one realized how important government was. One realized that countries with good governments like New Zealand
Yep.
did really well.
Yeah.
And countries with bad governments like the United States or Brazil did very badly. And I think everybody, you know, we all constantly discuss what does it mean to have a good government? How do you get a good government? But it certainly changed, I think, the focus of a lot of our attention into realizing the importance of collective action, of externalities, of how do we live together as communities.
Mm-hmm. We have a question we should ask about the book. The book you directed from, I think, was Roosevelt Foundation, right? And European Foundation. So from all the book, I mean, I read it, I promise. And it's a dense compilation of political and economical measures for Europe to prosper. But I would like you to maybe choose 2 or 3 that we haven't mentioned yet. So
yeah, so this book was called Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy. And the underlying idea was a very simple one, that in old-fashioned economics, you just talked about demand and supply, institutions, rules, didn't matter. It was the underlying forces of demand and supply. And the work that I've been doing over recent years says that's wrong. Yes, demand and supply is important, but the rules are important. And they are important for efficiency and equity for every aspect of our society. So one aspect I've been particularly interested in, of course, is how do we account for the degree of inequality, the rise in inequality? And one part of the rules that govern market power. If you have corporations that are able to exercise monopoly power, they're going to get for themselves more and more. And we see that in digital giants. And that has to do with rules about antitrust, corporate governance, financial markets, and so forth. But also the rules of labor, the rules that affect labor bargaining, unionization. If you have rules that weaken bargaining power of workers, obviously workers are going to go down and corporations are going to go up. Mm-hmm. So the call of that book was to say, let's go through systematically and rethink. Over 40 years, we've rewritten the rules guided by market fundamentalism and neoliberalism. It's now time to rethink all of those rules. Not just because of these changes in ideology, but also because we live in a 21st century economy. So even if we hadn't had changes in ideology, we would need to rewrite the rules. The digital economy needs new rules. So the two together, though, make it compelling. And so I view this as, you might say, the beginning of a process where I hope that there will be discussions in Europe and America, around the world, about how we rewrite the basic guidebook, the rules, to make our societies more just, more efficient, have more shared prosperity.
Mm-hmm. The last question will be precisely the last, I promise. The last question will be precisely on the digital monopoly and the platforms that are, for instance, rewriting on their benefit, exclusive benefit, the rules of newspapers, publishing, music distribution, and they have a gigantic lobby power. In the democratic campaign, I think it was Mrs. Warden that raised the question of monopoles over and over again. But how far do you think the Biden presidency, last question, I promise, can go on this respect? How can...
I think it can go a long way. 5 years ago, I would have been more hesitant. But two things have happened. The pandemic has shown that the people at the very top in the digital world have done very well as the rest of the society has suffered. So the awareness of inequalities and market power has become much, much greater. And at the same time, Americans, Europeans, everybody around the world have become much more aware of what I might call the multiple digital harms. Political manipulation, anti-vax movements, incitement, what happened on January 6th in the United States was all enabled by the digital giants who didn't fulfill their social responsibilities and were given a pass on accountability. So there's a lot of anger, and that means, Europe has been a little bit ahead of the United States in this, but I think the United States is now at a point where it will be a battle because, as you say, money matters. But I think the vast majority of Americans are now at a place where there can be meaningful discussions of this issue. And I have to go to class now, so...
Yeah, I am envious of your students.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Joe. Enjoy the class. I enjoy the conversation. Thanks again.